please choose the language that is best for you. Once you have clicked on the language you would like to hear, consider muting the original audio just for a better listening experience. And you can do this by selecting mute original audio at the bottom of the interpretation pop-up window. I am bilingual as well, so feel free to ask your questions in the language of your choice, and I can kind of do some freestyle translation on the fly, but we do have our interpreters. As well, if you wish to ask any questions, and there'll be multiple spaces in our conversation today for questions, reflections, and comments. You can do so either through the Menti or by using the raise your hand function on Zoom. And we'll make sure to pass over the mic at the appropriate time. Of course, the chat box is also available for that, and that's where we will also be dropping documents along as we go along in the presentation. At any point during the session, if you need any help, you can contact Mark Edwards through direct message in the chat box or via email, and our amazing admin assistant for this session has dropped Mark's email down into the chat box for you for reference. Okay. And so community note-taking, we explained a little bit about this earlier this morning. So the idea is really that we have an open Google Doc that everyone can feel free to share what marks them the most. And so there's a space there for general notes. There's a space for quotes or things that really stuck in your mind. So we're going to be sharing that document in the chat box as well to make sure you can access it. Please feel free to participate in the note-taking in any way you feel comfortable. All of these notes will be put together for participants at the end of the conference so that they can also have access to it afterwards. So feel free to participate in any way that you feel comfortable. And before we move on to our land acknowledgement and community agreements, I first wanted to say a big thank you to the team that's supporting us for this session. So a big thank you to Barbara, Melanie, and Mark, who's on standby from the Corporation Canada team. And of course, a huge thank you to our guests, who I will introduce as we go along into the session. And finally, to our interpreters, without whom we really couldn't offer you a maximized experience. So thank you, everyone. And so, well, I would like to start by making a land acknowledgement and to really acknowledge and honor the people in the treaty agreements and the unceded lands of Turtle Islands. And in terms of the land acknowledgement, I don't want this land acknowledgement to just be another sort of check-off box that we do. I really want us to use this as an intentional and thoughtful way to position ourselves to provide meaningful and thankful acknowledgement to the First Nations, Indigenous, and Métis communities whose land we occupy. I think as we do land acknowledgement, it is important to prioritize individual commitments to challenge and dismantle white supremacist colonial mindsets, which we have internalized both collectively and individually. With that being said, I acknowledge that as a settler immigrant to Canada, I live, gather, and organize on the traditional territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe, which is the traditional territory of the Mohawk and Anishinaabe people. I acknowledge that settler relationships to both the land and the people of this land have been broken. As we organize around anti-racism, decolonization, and the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, we recognize the ways in which our presence on this land can uphold colonialism and sometimes reproduce dispossession and violence for Indigenous people. For me, specifically reflecting on my relationship to the land, it is about how do I action my privilege, how do I action my gratefulness to the original and traditional keepers of the land, and how do I also support the Indigenous community, which I am a part of both here in Ottawa, but also in I live in Toronto. I am in Ottawa today, but I live in Toronto, which is the traditional territories of Anishinaabe, the Misagas of the Credit, and the Haudenosaunee. And so how do I action that within my own community where I live in Toronto? And in doing so, also, I commit to unlearning and examining my own internal biases and racist thoughts, which have caused harm both implicitly and explicitly. And I commit to continual research and unlearning warning of all of the harmful ways I have been socialized into. And so you will notice that I didn't really read off the slide because I think it's really important to have the land acknowledgements be centered around who you are and what your relationship to the land is. As we had our activity this morning, I hope you each take, even if it's just this second now, to really think about the ways we are connected to the land, but also the ways in which the land feeds us, lets us live, and lets us play. And yeah, with that, I am going to give you a quick overview of our session today. So we'll start with a little bit of ground setting. So just going through our community agreements as we are going through going to be talking about sensitive topics. And then we'll have a brief presentation on the victim-centered approach. And then there'll be a conversation around centering survivors. And finally, we'll be closing the session. The first thing is just I want to give a reminder that we do have psychosocial support available due to the sensitive nature of the work and all of the conversations that we'll be having today. Please, at any point, if you feel you need to step away, you need to grab a drink of water, do what you need to do to be comfortable and to be present and to take care of yourself. We do have a psychosocial support on call. So the folks at Mobuntu Counseling are really great. We've used them for years. And so please feel free. And it's also anonymous and confidential, so we don't have access to it. So if need be, they are there for you as well. Now, we just want to take a moment to go over a community agreement. So it's like an opportunity to really set a collective set of guidelines for how we are engaging with each other in the space. These may change throughout the presentation. And so before going through them, I would like to acknowledge that these community agreements were developed in collaboration with my ARC colleagues. They normally do community agreements, and we kind of took the Digna Code of Conduct and meshed the two together, and this is the result. But also acknowledging, of course, that the original idea was brought forward by the ARC team. And so for this conversation and this session today, we have 8 agreements. The first, that we are trusting you to do what you need to do to ensure your full participation and that you will communicate your needs as they change. 2, we are committing to building a safer space, prioritizing confidentiality, equitable participation, honesty, ownership over our words and actions. 3, we are coming here open-minded, intended to be respectful and accountable. We will call out harmful behavior. 4, we are committing to being respectful, candid, transparent, and fair to all participants regardless of language, race, national or ethnic origin, age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, marital status, ability, or others throughout the conference. We are committing creating a space for all in attendance to contribute and participate, to give prominence to the voices and stories of those who might otherwise be excluded, and to seek out the wisdom and reflection of those who may feel silenced. 6, we are committed to encouraging a forum in which the varied experiences of participants are given equal weight. 7, we are committing to participating in the forum with the spirit of openness to learning and a recognition that the broad diversity of participants includes experience and knowledge that is beyond my own and through which I grow. 8, we are committing to ensuring that the physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual safety of all of our participants in the conference, including by calling out harassment when it is witnessed and reporting incidents to conference organizers or other authorities as appropriate. And 8, we are committing to the broad goals of strengthening Canada's global leadership and recognize that all participants share those goals. In all conversations and forums, I remember that we are all on the same side and we seek to find common ground and inspiration. And so just taking a moment to, for everyone to have a chance to kind of digest these, let us know if there's anything that you think is missing. So I'm just gonna give a few seconds, and if there are any additions or questions. Okay. If not, I will then assume that we are all in agreement of our community agreements and move on to our community assumptions. So alongside the agreements we just stated, it's important to set out a list of statements that we are in fact agreeing with before moving forward with the conference. And so the statements are as follows. 1, all systems of oppression exist and are interconnected. 2, opposing systems of oppression, building alternatives, and cultural change are all necessary. 3, dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone. 4, confronting social injustice can be painful and or joyful. 5, liberation is possible. 6, we are all here because we want and choose to be here. 7, we live at intersections. We all benefit and are harmed by systematic oppression, even if in different ways. 8, an individual community is the expert of their own experience and the solutions to the problems they face. 9, everyone deserves the autonomy of choice. And 10, the body doesn't lie. So again, just giving a few moments for these community assumptions, making sure we are all comfortable and understand them before we get into the real meat of our conversation today. I don't see any hands up, and with that, I am very pleased to start our session off. First, I will start us off by getting a sense of who is in the room, and therefore, I'm asking all of you to please join me on Mentimeter. We will be using Mentimeter throughout the session, and you can actually just scan this code through your phone, and it will pull up the Menti page. There's just a couple of questions first to get to know who we are, and then throughout the session, you'll be able to use this tool to ask questions, to give your reflections, and to see what responses others are also giving. So this is the code that you enter, or you can directly scan the QR code that's on this page. Okay. Oh, and can I ask my tech commander to please put the code in the chat? I forgot to put it down. So I'll go to the first question. Quite simple. So the first questions are really around who is in the room. And so for the reporting purposes, we do need to ask, we're trying to see who is in the room, what makes up the population of the folks here today that will be a part of our discussion. For this question, I think it's very interesting. We do normally get a much higher percentage of folks identifying as women. Not sure if there's direct correlation, but just interesting to see. Just giving a few more seconds for folks to input. Okay. Ooh, yeah. So we're still around the same percentages in terms of the gender. For the next question, what size is your organization? We want to see what kind of folks do we have in the room. Do we have folks from small organizations, from medium organizations, from smaller organizations? Do we have some folks from the government with us today? Let's see who we're sharing space with today. We have a few folks from each category, which is really nice. I think it will lead to a much more dynamic conversation. It's very great. I see that most of the respondents are from organizations that are 30 plus employees, so fairly larger organizations. And what is your role in the organization? Are you part of the leadership? Are you part of the focal point, specifically working around PSEAH? Are you part of the general staff of your nonprofit or NGO, or do you work for government or other? Yes, I think these results are a little bit what I was expecting. So a couple of folks, of course, that are from NGO staff, and then folks who are specifically focused on PSEAH. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. And then the final question, and this is a question I will ask at the end before we get into really the discussions about the VCA and the core standards and all of that. What would you say is your level of awareness of national and international legal frameworks related to sexual exploitation, abuse, and even harassment, related to the reporting processes, investigation, or specifically around the survivor-centered approach? Okay. So we have quite a number of people who would say moderate, followed by high, and then a few people who say low. So I think this is actually a great mix of people. I think we'll have a lot of learning, but also hopefully those of you who have either moderate or high awareness will also be able to engage and input into the conversations that we'll be having today. Okay. All right. So thank you all for bearing with me for this first part of the Mentimeter. And it's very, very interesting to see. So now that we've laid the foundations for the event, it really is my pleasure to welcome you all to what I hope will be a very engaging session with some really, really interesting discussions. With that being said, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Anne-Marie Connor, who serves as the Special Advisor to the World Vision International President for the Interagency Standing Committee Preventing Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Championship, which Andrew Morley assumed January 1st, 2022. Anne-Marie also most recently served as the National Director for World Vision in the DRC. Throughout her 15-year-plus humanitarian career, she has held roles in leadership, emergency and coordination, strategy development and execution in highly complex and conflict-affected countries. She champions protection and safeguarding in the world's toughest places. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Anne-Marie, and I will stop sharing my screen so that she can take over.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Bear with me one moment while I bring up my screen here. Great. Can you see the screen and hear me okay? Wonderful. Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Fanta, for the invitation to speak with you during this conference. I very much appreciate the time that you've provided and the time that you are all taking out of what I know are your very busy schedules to learn a bit more about what we've been doing as the IASC PSEAH champion, and acknowledge also the opportunity to learn from you and your experiences, both within your organization as well as your personal experiences. So thank you so much. Before I get into the meat of the presentation, I did want to also make a few housekeeping notes on my end. So first of all, I'm going to be mentioning a number of different documents and a number of different organizations that you may or may not be familiar with. I did note that there is certainly a high level of comfort with these concepts and terms. We will be sharing links within the chat so you can reference various documents. And I'll also be able to, if they aren't shared, the foundational document that I'm sharing, which is the definition and principles, also includes hyperlinks to a number of different resources that you can draw upon as we move forward. The other note on terminology that I wanted to make is around the use of the term victim/survivor. As I speak, you may hear me using the term victim more frequently. That is simply for ease of presentation And I want to acknowledge that victim and survivors of gender-based violence and sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment may self-identify as either victims or survivors. Organizationally, different organizations use survivor or victim. So because, as I'll get into it, the IASC is an organization and network that brings together UN as well as NGO networks. For ease, we decided to use the term victim survivor so that we could focus on the content of our definition and principles, simply because organizationally we would not agree. There are very strong stances on whether to use victim or survivor. So I did want to take a moment to acknowledge that. But I am not valuing one over the other. What is the Interagency Standing Committee? Some of you might be quite familiar with it, but others may not be. So for those that aren't, the Interagency Standing Committee is the highest decision-making body for humanitarian affairs. The IASC is chaired by Martin Griffiths, who also is the head of the Office of the Coordinator of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA. OCHA is, of course, a key coordinating body within the UN for humanitarian affairs. And the IASC, or the Interagency Standing Committee, brings together the heads of agencies of UN operational agencies. So organizations like UNHCR, the World Food Program, UNICEF, UNFPA, UN Women, etc. So a number of UN agencies, as well as key NGO networks, the IFRC, so the Federation of the Red Cross, and NGO networks like the CHS Alliance and ICVA, as well as Interaction. So those are three key humanitarian NGO networks, and many of your organizations will be members of those NGO networks and then feed into the IASC. So wanted to just provide that preamble. And I've learned a lot about the IASC over the last 2 years, so happy to answer some questions about that. The IASC has within its mandate the prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, as well as harassment. And beginning in 2011, it was determined that a senior leadership, political, and advocacy role was important to help foster change in the humanitarian sector as it relates to preventing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. The first IASC champion for preventing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment was the late William Swing at IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and various key UN leaders have held the position, executive directors from UNHCR, from UNICEF, most recently from UNFPA, and Andrew Morley, who is World Vision's president and CEO, but also chair of the Steering Committee for Humanitarian Response, which is another NGO network. He is the first non-UN leader to hold the position, and he has held the position since last year. And he does so in his role as the chair of the Standing Committee for Humanitarian Response. You can learn more about the IASC champion on protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. There is the link there on the screen, and if you put in IASC champion into your search network, you'll be able to find that. So I did just want to center the conversation around this championship, so we're clear on who I am and where I'm coming from, and the unique perspective that I hold because of that position. I also wanted to spend just a few brief minutes before getting into the VCA, just to give you a bit of sense about what we've been working on as the IASC PSEAH champion over the last about 18 months. So we've had 3 priorities over our 2-year championship. The first has been to lead the IASC to agree upon a joint definition of a victim survivor-centered approach, which we'll spend time on this afternoon. The second is to ensure the second priority was a systems priority, and it's really about ensuring that in the countries of highest concern for sexual exploitation and abuse, that there are high capacity PSEAH coordinators that sit within the UN that are able to lead PSEAH networks, which is the coordinating body for prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse at country level in the 15 highest risk contexts. The third priority is around culture and supporting strong analysis about what are some of the challenges that we continue to face when it comes to changing our culture, and what prevents us from preventing and responding to sexual exploitation and abuse in the humanitarian sector. So what have we achieved through our championship? So we have developed and we have had endorsed the victim survivor centered approach definition and principles. I'll go into those, of course, in a lot of detail. Related to the second priority, we have established a deployment mechanism to support the identification, the training, training, deployment, and support of PSEAH coordinators to the 15 highest risk contexts, and we've done fundraising around that mechanism. As it relates to culture, we've done a number of articles, simulations for leaders, particularly for humanitarian coordinators, on how to use and ensure a victim survivor-centered approach in their programs, as well as a number of panels. We are also conducting what we're calling a gray literature review. So looking at all the existing literature and available content on existing challenges around our collective humanitarian sector culture around preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. That cultural snapshot will be soon available, and certainly we'll share it with Digna and be available to provide further insight into that research in the coming months ahead of the close of our championship. Okay, so that's a bit about our IASC championship generally. And now I do want to spend the rest of my time. And Fanta, I realize I did not check what time I started. So please do shout if I'm going over time, just to make sure that we're allowing plenty of time for good engagement with the team. Thanks. Okay. As I said, when the SCHR and World Vision was developing its priorities, one of the key issues that came back over and over again was that as a sector and as an IASC in particular, there was not a joint policy or guideline around what it means to be victim survivor centered in our work. In 2021, the IASC PSEAH champion, who at that time was Natalie Kadem from UNFPA, the executive director of UNFPA, commissioned an external review. And that external review was an evaluation or a review of the response to sexual exploitation and abuse of the IASC. And that's a really helpful read. I will share the link to that document in the chat a bit later. But around our engagement with victim survivors, it found inaction, it found confusion, and generally that the lack of a definition and clear principles for the IASC was leading to wholly varying response and support for victim survivors across different agencies. And was really in some cases, frankly, leading to poor practice, and was used as an excuse to not properly support and engage survivors, and that urgently needed to change. And you can learn again more about that in the IASC external review and what the findings were. So what we aimed to do was to develop a simple, plain language, relatively short document using non-technical language so that it was accessible to humanitarian leaders and managers. And I know on this call, we have a lot of PSEAH focal points and those that are regularly engaged in safeguarding and preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. But as we crafted this document, we recognized that we needed to develop a document that could be easily read by leaders and managers who are often making decisions around incident or case management at field level. The drafting of the document took over a year, and one of the reasons for that is because there was considerable disagreement on the approach we should take, and I do want to acknowledge that. As we review this document together, you may be frustrated by the lack of minimum standards or detail. You may have questions around why haven't you put explicit explicit standards around response timelines, investigation timelines. And I do want to acknowledge that this document is a policy global guideline and will not meet the technical or practical needs of all of you and all of your teams responding to sexual exploitation and abuse and harassment. But it aims to be a first step. And I will be able to spend a bit of time at the end explaining a bit about what World Vision International has done in order to build in standards and what some other organizations have done. So I do want to acknowledge that. That being said, this document does draw on and is consistent with previously issued guidance at the IASC level. In particular, I want to reference the interagency minimum standards for GBV and emergency programming. Our GBV area of responsibility colleagues have developed several detailed technical guidelines for how to respond to GBV. And of course, we acknowledge, and I didn't do that at the beginning, but let me do so now, that sexual exploitation and abuse on the part of humanitarian workers and peacekeeping is a form of gender-based violence. And so we draw on the work of our GBV AOR colleagues, in particular this document, but a number of others that you'll see in the definition itself. And just to point, there is a link in the chat to the definition and principles. Before I go into the definition and principles, apologies, just looking at my notes on my phone here. As I said, we did draw in particular on 9 source documents, and the consultation process was done with a number of different entities, including the IASC Technical Advisory Group, which brings together the PSEAH focal points, technical focal points from a number of UN agencies and NGO consortiums. We engaged with PSEAH coordinators at field level in the highest risk contexts, as well as safeguarding and PSEAH focal points from a number of different NGOs. So quite simply, what we wanted to do is provide a very brief definition that could be used as an anchor. I'll read it here. A victim survivor centered approach places the rights, wishes, needs, safety, dignity, and well-being of the victim survivor at the center of all prevention and response measures concerning sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment. We developed a number of principles and key actions, and you will find the detailed breakdown of those principles and key actions in the document itself. I won't be able to read all of those. It's about a 2-page document, but please, I really encourage you to review that following this session. I did want to point to a number of key principles and key actions. Firstly, I really want to acknowledge the first 4 principles. Those are safety, security, well-being, confidentiality, dignity and respect, non-discrimination, and inclusion. Those 4 principles mirror the principles that are included in the GBV minimum standards. So we are mirroring the key principles that they have developed. And these 4 principles are consistent across all of the resources that we have used. Safety, security, and well-being of victim survivors must be our primary consideration. All principles and key actions must adhere to that core consideration, that the safety of a victim survivor as well as their families is of utmost importance. Within this principle, within the principles and key actions, we also sought to further define and clarify the notion of confidentiality. Within the GBV sector, confidentiality is often seen as for lack of a better word that's coming to mind, as black and white, that a victim survivor has the right to complete confidentiality. What we have had to do here, and one of the main issues that we had a lot of discussion around, was around confidentiality. Because we have to acknowledge, when it comes to sexual exploitation and abuse, that organizations have a duty of to prevent further harm. So here we have acknowledged that mandatory reporting is likely in place. It is in place for UN organizations, and most organizations do have some sort of mandatory reporting policy in place. So we have sought here to acknowledge the need to clarify to victim survivors when mandatory reporting considerations are in place, to be able to explain what mandatory reporting is to a victim survivor, and to be able to share with them what some of the potential consequences of them sharing information about an incident might be. And I recognize that there's constant tension and debate around mandatory reporting and confidentiality, and that the IASC has made decisions around language based on the particular legal requirements that exist. We've included a principle, of course, around non-discrimination, but have expanded it to include inclusion. So non-discrimination around sexual orientation, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, and seeking to adapt our incident, our case management, our support, and engagement with victim survivors based on their particular needs. We have a principle around ask, listen, and engage. This is a principle that is a bit different than other source resources, and seeks to advance a trauma-informed approach. Now, you'll note that we're using language around a survivor-centered approach rather than a trauma-informed approach for the umbrella definition, but we are really seeking, through this and documents that will follow, to begin adopting a trauma-informed approach, in particular when engaging with victim survivors. We want to ensure organizations and entities are being transparent and providing information. We acknowledge that in the past, victim and survivors often did not receive regular information, were not updated on cases, waited sometimes months and years to receive information on investigations, and this is critical that this changes. Very closely connected to confidentiality, informed consent, and choice. We want to ensure that victim survivors understand and are able to provide their active consent to participate and engage with organizations as they manage or investigate incidences of sexual exploitation and abuse. Support and assistance. This is a principle that likely that I can say has had the most Where there are the most resources and guidance, though not necessarily budget. What we have sought here is to expand the definition of support and assistance end to end. So to ensure that we are not providing token support and assistance, but that we are providing quality support and assistance, and that definition of what quality means is being adapted to the particular context in which a survivor or a victim lives. One of the last principles is redress. Often in the past, organizations have prioritized organizational risk management over and above the needs and safety of victim survivors. So here we have sought to clarify that organizations must support and allow victim survivors to seek redress from perpetrators, whether or not that is legal redress or parental support redress, whatever it may mean in that particular context. We also want to ensure that organizations are ensuring that they have feedback mechanisms in place that are adapted to the needs of victim survivors, and that victim survivors can feed back to organizations on their experience following disclosure of an incident to redress, that they can provide feedback on investigations, provide feedback on the support and assistance they've received, provide feedback on the engagement and the interaction that they have had with NGO or UN staff. And of course, we've also provided a particular provision on child victims, considering their unique needs. So that is a very brief snapshot on the principles and key actions. Of course, as we move through the Q&A, I'll be pleased to provide more information. And again, you can see the language that's included under those principles and key actions within the document itself. As I said, this document is really one piece of the puzzle to improve our support and our organizational positioning on victim survivors. There are a number of additional resources. They are included as hyperlinks. I encourage you to look at those. But as I said, we made a conscious decision that this would be high-level policy guidance and would not provide necessarily minimum standards for organizations. But we recognize that there's ongoing gaps that we need to address, and the IASC is seeking to address those in a number of different ways. I want to draw your attention to a few of those here. UNICEF has developed, and it was published, if I'm correct, in 2019, a technical note on the provision of assistance of victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. The link to that document is in the resources page of the definition and principles. However, following a number of feedback, in particular from NGOs, UNICEF will be reviewing and updating that technical note to provide additional resources for colleagues at country level in order to be able to ensure a better and quality assistance. We also recognize, again, I spent quite a few moments on mandatory reporting. There is a recognition that we need to be able to provide simpler information on what mandatory reporting means, distinguishing mandatory reporting. In particular countries, we have mandatory reporting within organizations. In some contexts, we also have mandatory reporting for SEA to the authorities. So we want to be able to provide information, country context specific on what mandatory reporting means, as well as simple language scripts to be able to explain what mandatory reporting is to victim survivors. I want to draw particular attention here to CHS Alliance's foundational paper on survivor existing survivor resources. This document was published about the same time as our definition. We drew heavily on it, and as the IASC moves forward, it will continue to draw heavily on it, and it really provides a useful tool to understand what resources currently exist and what remains to be developed in order to have a true victim survivor centered approach. When it comes to a victim survivor centered approach, the external review that I mentioned at the beginning, and perhaps in your own personal experience, you'll have noted that when managing incidences, in particular when investigating incidences of sexual exploitation and abuse, there's significant failures in adhering to a victim survivor centered approach. And the UN has established an expert panel on investigations to meet a victim survivor centered approach. And while that process will certainly be very much based on the particular needs of the UN, it's hoped that it will have key lessons and guidance for governments and for NGOs and local organizations to consider how they can adapt their own investigations. I did also want to, and I mentioned this at the beginning, give a bit of information on how World Vision is working in order to improve our victim survivor centered approach. So considering this new VCA that was endorsed by the IASC, considering the CHS Alliance foundational paper, considering as well Interaction's core standards. Interaction, of course, is the US equivalent to Cooperation Canada. They have developed core standards which do include some detailed minimum standards. I encourage you to have a look at that document as well. What we have done is, as an organization, we've reviewed all of the existing guidance. We have reviewed all of our existing, our safeguarding policy, our investigations policies, and we've looked at where we as an organization continue to have gaps, and where we need to revise our policies or develop additional tools, in particular around investigations, in particular around ensuring that that budgets exist in order to provide survivor support and assistance. And these aren't quick fixes. we've developed an action plan. We've noted that that action plan will take 2 to 3 years to fully implement, considering the number of policy changes. But I do encourage you, if your organization does not have its own policy on a victim survivor centered approach, to consider the number of different documents that have been developed, including this VCA, as well as other tools that are available, in order to consider how you might develop your own document. The last note that I want to make before I close this portion of the presentation is that we very much hope that this document can serve as an advocacy tool. An advocacy tool both within your own organization to establish, to develop rather, your own internal policy on a survivor or victim-centered approach, as well as advocacy with your organization's donors. We recognize that in our highest risk contexts, we continue to have key challenges in providing quality assistance. We continue to have challenges in having trained, trauma-informed investigations, and that will require a whole of sector change, particularly in ensuring that we are reinforcing our budgets to meet the needs of victim survivors. And we do hope that this will be a useful advocacy tool. I will stop there. Here again, these are the resources that are available. They are hyperlinked in the document, so you'll be able to click and find those directly. I did mention the GBV, AOR, UNFPA interagency minimum standards, the UNICEF technical note, number 8, which is interactions core standards, as well as number 9, CHS Alliance's foundational paper. So all of these are really helpful and useful documents, and give you insight into how we have developed our definition principles and key actions. And I hope they would also be useful resources to you as you develop your own resources internally. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you for the presentation. Before we move on to the next portion of our session, which is going to be more conversational, and we'll be bringing in another guest, we wanted to give a little bit of time. We understand that the information that Anne-Marie just presented is quite dense, and so there might be a bit of questions. We did get one question already in the chat, Anne-Marie, and the question asks, could you please speak more to what you just said regarding trauma-informed versus survivor-centered?
Great. And just give me one moment here. I'm going to I've stopped sharing my screen.
Oh yes,
but happy to refer to those as needed. But this way I can see the chat a bit more easily.
And just as you get that set up, I just wanted to let folks know you can actually ask your questions as well directly in the Menti, and it will pop up here for Anne-Marie to see, or you can put them in the chat. Either way, we will get to you for the questions.
So I want to acknowledge here that I am not an expert on a trauma-informed approach. The debate that we had, debate isn't the right word, so bear with me here. But the discussion we had here was around we decided to use a survivor-centered approach and bring in the principle of trauma-informed, because we recognized that there was a significant change process that was needed in our guidance and policy in order to be truly trauma informed. And that included ensuring that our technical focal points and safeguarding focal points at the field level or at program and project level understood what it means to be trauma informed. So we've included language about being trauma informed, but we didn't use that as our umbrella term because it was felt that the IASC was not in a position to yet be in a place where it was truly trauma informed. And I say that because there is a recognition that this document is a cornerstone, but that significant specific guidance and guidelines are needed as we move forward. So I don't know that necessarily answered your question. You may be more well versed or trained in a trauma informed approach than I am, but we have really wanted to specify that in engagement and interaction with victim survivors, that is absolutely critical, but not necessarily, but haven't used that as the umbrella term.
We have another question in the chat that asks, can you discuss how the World Vision PSEAH Championship addressed the issue of reporting to local authorities where there was credible information about a serious crime, for example, in cases of sexual exploitation and abuse and children?
So to be frank, we haven't addressed that issue in particular, because the championship is a high level policy and advocacy. We've had three, we have three particular priorities that we focused on. But again, we do recognize that additional resources at the program and project level are necessary. And we're working with the IASC in order to develop those. One thing that I didn't mention at the beginning, but I should have, is our the championship is only one piece of a larger strategy on the part of the IASC to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse. So there is an IASC strategy. It's a strategy for 2021 to 2025, I believe. And I can also share the link to that. So our three priorities are three work streams that are part of a much larger package. I did also want to just clarify a point. I realize it's perhaps a moot point, but the championship really is under the Standing Committee for Humanitarian Response. That is an INGO collective that is made up of World Vision, but also Oxfam, CARE, ICR, the IFRC, ActionAid, and a number of others. So I am speaking to you as SCHR, and while World Vision might pay my salary, and Andrew Morley is World Vision's president and CEO, he is the IASC champion in his role as the chair of SCHR. So I did just want to reinforce that point.
Okay, I think one more question before, the question is on the screen before we move on to the next portion. Don't worry, folks. There is also going to be space for more open conversation and questions after the next portion. So, if you have a question, hold it. You'll get another chance as well to ask the questions. So the final question we have here, Anne-Marie says, do you have resources on PSEA in other languages? And what are you doing to make PSEA more accessible?
So for the IASC, all tools, all guidance are being translated into the 6 UN languages at minimum. And given the highest risk contexts, are also, and there are a number of contexts that have been designated as high risk. The UN has done a detailed data analysis. I can also include information on that for those that aren't familiar. They've done a risk overview. And so there are about 30 contexts and countries that are within that overview. And so tools are being developed in those particular contexts as well. If those contexts don't regularly use, the 6 UN languages.
All right, thank you, Anne-Marie. And I'm sure there are other questions, but unfortunately, we have to cut it short right now. I really wanted to first have Anne-Marie come and present sort of the technical information for us, give us a background of the principles that a lot of this work is anchored in. On the opposite side, and before we really get into what's going to be our next session, I wanted to also get a perspective that's a little more on the ground from a survivor, from someone who also works in the field, is a leader in the field, and uh, uh, really invite, as we go into the next part of this session, into conversation, both Anne-Marie and Ramisha, who I'll be introducing shortly, and then all of you here on this call. So without further ado, please help me welcome Ramisha Kazi. She is a member of Digna's advisory committee. She's the global gender lead at the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. She was also the chair of Digna's survivor-centered working group. Ramisha's story comes from a survivor's perspective, and she's sharing her experience today for the purpose of learning and reflection. We recognize that this might be triggering for some of you, and so you are welcome to step out during this introduction and come back. Remember that we do have psychosocial support available, very, very pleased to have you here. And without further ado, Ramisha, over to you.
Thanks so much, Fanta. So I am coming to you live from northern Pakistan. So if at any point my internet cuts out, I do apologize. Work decided on a very last minute trip for me to come out here. So this was not a planned excursion for me, but we roll with the punches. So as Fanta said, I am coming to you with my experience as a survivor. And I won't go into any great details about anything. So hopefully everyone can stay on the call and we won't need to leverage any of the support that's being shared in the chat. But my experience as a survivor comes from being overseas on a contract for an organization that sends youth abroad for internship placements from Canada. And the organization that I was working with at the time was not prepared to deal with an event like this occurring. And the reaction from our stakeholders at the time was also not great. We were told certain things from some of our stakeholders, such as, this happened outside of work hours, so it's not part of our responsibility or our mandate to take care of this. And the resources that were available to me as a Canadian overseas were severely, severely lacking. At the time, the country that I was in, did not recognize rape as being a real event that occurs for people. And so the health services that were available to me as a survivor were not up to standard by any means. And then the support that I received from the Canadian consulate in that country was also very lacking. It was very clear that the consular officers were not trained in survivor-centered or trauma-informed approaches in any shape or form. I was told things such as, if you don't report this to the police, if this person does this again, it's on your shoulders. And that was said to me by a Canadian who is paid by Canadian taxpayers' money. And so I really joined this Digna space and this space as a survivor right after this happened to me, because I realized that, as someone who really believes in international development and really works in this gender equality space, that the supports that we offer to people who need them in crisis are not up to standard. And one of the projects that Digna has helped me launch is the Survivor Guides, which is a project that we launched last June. And it's on the Digna website. And really it just is that the thought came to me that Canadians as young as 16 years old are doing these international development placements. They go overseas, usually alone, usually very underfunded, as I'm sure most of the people on this call can relate to. We do a lot of these things that we do for free at the beginning of our careers. And so the resources that we have access to are already limited. And I was very fortunate during this time that I lived with a fellow Canadian woman who was able to accompany me to the hospital, was able to accompany me to the Canadian consulate, and was really there for me. But usually when we go on these internships and these placements, we're alone. And most organizations' policies have not been put to the test. And so they are very reactive in how they deal with these situations. So my passion project and, what I really believe in is these Country Guys project that's been linked in the chat now. And all it is that we do the mapping for the resources that are available in country before an incident occurs. So, there's a document on this website, on this webpage, that really outlines the kinds of information that we should be looking for and how we should be going about this. So, we want to outline the legal context that you're walking into for any given country. You want to outline what kind of medical services are available for you. So for example, the country that I was in, and you'll notice that I'm being very careful to not share the name of the country, but the country that I was in at the time did not offer Plan B of any kind to anybody, no matter who you are or what instance happened to you, but they gave 30 days of PrEP drugs for free for anybody. You didn't have to really disclose what happened to you to get those. So really outlining what are the resources that will be available to you if something happens to you in a hospital, but also outlining what hospitals or clinics you can actually go to. So if you study the landscape of different countries, you will come to learn that not all hospitals are equipped to provide rape kits or to do any kind of testing for survivors of any kind because of the legal restrictions that they face in this country. And so at the beginning of my night, that night, I was sent to a hospital that could not support me in any way, shape, or form. And then I was asked to go to a different hospital. So that's one extra step that could just be avoided if organizations do this extra step before they send any of their staff overseas. So the legal context, the medications that are available, the hospitals you can go to, and then also looking at the other NGOs that can provide support. So when you look at grassroots organizations in a lot of countries that we already work in, some of them offer support to come to a hospital with you to help you navigate the system that's in place, because it's not intuitive. It's not easy to navigate on your own or even with an accompanying person. So I came up with this project and I've been working on it since 2019. in my spare time for free for organizations because there's no budget to do a lot of these PSEAH activities that are really, really important. And so far to date, we have developed 17 country guides for countries that Canadian organizations are sending youth to do internships. And so that's sort of been my starting platform, my starting space to be able to get some of these resources out. And I'm currently in the process of defending my master's thesis in feminist and gender studies that is exactly looking at Canadian NGOs that send youth abroad and the policies that are in place, and that they are not survivor-centered or trauma-informed. And how do we sort of rectify this space that we're currently living in, because organizations have been sending youth for many, many years, but this legwork has just not been done. And it's one of those things that I continuously, and I'm sure that a lot of people on this call continuously are told there's no budget to do this. And so those of us who want to see a difference in this space sometimes are doing this work for free. And so hopefully together we can navigate how do we change some of these things. But having this platform at Digna for me as a survivor has been really important, because I feel like I'm very privileged in this situation that I'm in, that I have a really great support system that I can actually talk about what happened to me and share my experiences, so that other women, no matter what nationality they are, no matter what country they're in, might not have to suffer the way that I did when I was dealing with this as sort of as an emergency situation. And I think it's really important that we create the space at all of the tables that we are at to have space for survivors who are willing to and able to come forward to share their experience, to leverage the lessons that they've learned, because a lot of us have some really painful lessons that we've had to learn firsthand, and no one is listening and no one is doing enough to change the space that we're in. So that's part of it. The other part of it is you know, Anne-Marie talked about some of this discourse. It's a very visceral reaction to being called a victim, because although this happened to me, it does not define who I am and it does not define my life. And I was lucky enough, even as terrible as that sounds, I was lucky enough to survive. And I am continuing to survive every day. And the reason that I think that some of these conversations can continue in the way that they do is because not a lot of survivors have the privilege to come forward with their stories to create change in whatever way that looks like, but we are also not invited to the table. So as a survivor, I have been asking for a seat at various tables for a long, long time now. And Digna is one of the only spaces that has made us see sure that I am listened to, and that is not a privilege that most survivors are afforded. And so I know that I carry that, but that is also not a privilege that most organizations or more spaces are willing to even offer people. So it's really important that when we are talking about some of the semantics around these conversations, is that they're not just conversations that people who don't have lived experience in actually going through any of these very terrible situations are deciding for us. And so, you know, I have a very visceral reaction to being called a victim, and a very different reaction to being called a survivor. And it's really, really important that we are offering seats at the table to people who have the lived experience that not everyone has to carry with them. And I feel like I've been talking for a really long time, so Fanta, please do feel free to, you know, let me know. And Yeah, I believe in echoing what Anne-Marie said about having a whole of sector approach. I don't think that any of these things are going to change if just one person or just one organization are trying to move them forward and create the change that we all would like to see. And I know that a lot of times it's out of our hands as well. But wherever we can keep fighting this fight, that we push the narrative that we are not working for survivors. We are working with survivors, and we need to be, it's 2023. It's about time that we are listening to the survivors that feel privileged enough to come forward and say, I am a survivor. This is what happened to me. And these are the resources I'm telling you will fill the gap that currently exists. And instead of sidelining these voices, which continues to happen every day, and as a survivor, I will tell you that it happens every day, even in my job, that we need to be listening. We need to be making the space to listen. And I know that it has a dollar sign attached to it. I know that it takes time and money and resources away from the rest of our very important, very big jobs, but it's something that we have to do. And once my thesis is finished and I've defended and it's ready to be published, I'm sure that Fanta will afford me the space to also share it through Digna with all of you, and we can have another conversation about what it means to talk about survivor versus victim, what it means to actually be survivor centered and trauma informed. It was so important. I've been able to make 17 of them for free since 2019. And I'm sure that if we were all able to pool just a little bit of the resources that we have access to, we would be able to make them for every single country. And it would be such a better space that if something happens to you, because I'm not naive enough to believe that in my lifetime this problem will go away, but if something happens to you, there's a resource that exists that can help you in that moment. And that is the most critical time.
Thank you so much, Ramisha. I just want to before we move on, I just want to take a second. Thank you for sharing your experience. Thank you for your bravery. And I know regardless of, how many times you tell it, I imagine it is hard each time. So thank you for braving this for us and for really being so candid and so vulnerable with us today in today's session. So thank you. And this kind of brings us to the next part of our session. I think the idea of this session was to have an overview of really what the institutional basis for the core principles of our work in terms of safeguarding and the survivor-centered approach come from, which Anne-Marie gave us. And then we have the view and perspective of a survivor like Ramisha, and how do these actually play on the ground? How are the supports that we are sort of drafting up here, how are they actually implemented for the survivors in the situations? I did see a question in the chat before I open up the floor, because we will open up the floor for questions, for reflections as well, for sharing from all of you, those of you who feel open to sharing about your own experiences. But I would like to kind of first start with a question, one for Anne-Marie, and then I will have a question for you, Ramisha. But after sort of hearing Ramisha's story and through your own presentation, Anne-Marie, I think my question is, in your experience, what would you say are sort of the key elements of a survivor-centered support system? What are the things that are key, and how can Canadian organizations specifically better provide these?
So thank you, Ramisha, very much for sharing your story. I did want to, first of all, before answering your question, Fanta, acknowledge the challenge of using the term victim. I recognize that it can cause visceral reactions. I have to acknowledge that as the PSEAH champion, we're working within a challenging framework. Organizations like the UN continue to decide to use the term victim for a whole host of reasons, including legal reasons. My personal and I've had to set aside, my personal view in cases to be able to advance the definition principle, but I acknowledge that. Around your particular question, Fanta, thank you, and thank you for all of the questions that have been asked, and I know I didn't answer all of them, and I'm of course available to do that as we move forward throughout this session. So around the key elements of a survivor-centered support system, I think the Ramisha has alluded to some of those, and there's been a conversation in the chat, I believe, the reference to Plan B. So a few comments here. So first of all, organizations need to have their own survivor-centered approach, policies, and guidelines. The international standards are helpful, but each organization needs to develop guidance, because without policies that are approved at the highest levels of organization, it's impossible to then consider the practical aspects. And the practical aspects do 99.9% of the time come down to budget and being able to ensure that we're able to provide support and assistance. So encourage everyone here, if your organization doesn't have one, to look at the IASC VCA, but the core standards and the CHS Alliance foundational paper in particular as really, really critical, useful documents in developing your own policy. Secondly, at program and project level, the GBV subcluster and the PSEAH networks in places where those exist require additional funding. And we, throughout this work and throughout the development of the guidance, I've knocked up against the challenge of, we can have these policies in place, but until more than 1% of funding is going to GBV services, we are not going to meet the needs of survivors, because we are sending survivors to health centers for support where the staff don't have the resources, they don't have the basic supplies like PEP kits and PrEP kits to be able to provide victims and survivors. We're sending them for psychosocial support with staff that have not been trained on trauma-informed approaches. So really, it absolutely comes down to ongoing engagement, ongoing advocacy, ongoing push to donors to expand their funding for GBV services. That was a very long answer to your question, but so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I'm sure some elements of what you just mentioned will probably come up in Ramisha's answer to the question. I can already see her nodding. And Ramisha, to kind of flip that question a little bit back to you in terms of your experience and your advice that you would give to individuals and to organizations looking to adopt and strengthen their survivor-centered approach in PSEAH, particularly within our specific sector.
Yeah, so I mean, I would also say that budget is probably the number one thing that I get to hear from organizations. They say that we just don't have enough funding, we just don't have enough staff. And you know, not to toot my own horn or anything, but the survivor's guide that was linked in the chat while I was speaking, I've made it a very easy, you know, step-by-step document that you can send to your implementing partners in any country, and they just have to fill it in, and it's a very straightforward form. So that's one of the things that I'm suggesting as you know, an easy, quick, dirty fix to these issues. Another thing that I've been able to develop through my master's research at looking at all of these organizational policies that are available online, and I used the Digna resource library to really do most of my research. And I've been able to develop like a really quick checklist of like 20 things that a survivor-centered trauma-informed policy needs to have in order to actually be effective when you go to implement it. Because a lot of our policies kind of sit in this theoretical space that never actually need to be used, and that's fantastic. But when you do need to use them, then it comes to light, you know, what the gaps are and where we don't actually understand how these resources work and things like that. So that's another tool that I would really suggest. And one of the other challenges that I would say is that I'm not the only survivor who's come out of international development spaces. I'm not the only survivor who's loud about my story, who's trying to make these changes. And so, you know, I fortunately have not had to experience this, but survivors who've come before me that I've been in conversations with have said, you know, we've been blacklisted from the space rather than the space listening to us from what we tell them is the gap in their policies, in their operations, in how they understand how survivors are treated in the countries that we go to. And instead of siloing these voices and pushing them to the side and making them sign NDAs, we should really be creating the space to listen to them. It's really hard, even in my role at the organization that I work for, it's really hard to acknowledge that we failed something or that we failed someone, because we work in a space where we're trying to support communities and people and empower them. And so to acknowledge that we've done something that has led to a failure is really, really hard. But if we can just sort of move past that discomfort and create the space to listen to these voices that want to just see a brighter future for the next person who's going to go through this, that's going to eliminate a lot of the issues that organizations face in implementing these survivor-centered approaches or these trauma-informed approaches. Not to say that all of the barriers that exist for us are made by us. One of the bigger barriers, if I can throw a little bit of shade the way of one of our biggest donors, is that it's taken a really, really long time for Canadian organizations to convince global affairs that, you know, PSEAH is one thing, but PSHEA is a whole other thing. And to ignore harassment when we talk about PSEAH is a disservice to people, and that we are saying to them that harassment doesn't matter, it doesn't actually have any harmful impacts on you and your career and your day-to-day life, all of these things. And so if we can, and this conversation happened a long time before Digna existed, a long time before Global Affairs was even looking at these things, where, you know, Bond already had all of these sort of lessons learned and these growing pains with their donors, and were able to come to a space where they include harassment. So if we can just sort of leverage the lessons learned from other organizations, other PSEAH hubs, you know, I think that that would eliminate a lot of the growing pains that we're sort of experiencing as a sector in Canada as well.
Thank you so much, Ramisha. Now, I will go to the next slide and invite all of you to kind of join in the conversation. But actually, before the mentee, so that because sometimes the mentee confuses things. I think there were a couple of reflections in the chat, and I would invite the folks who put their reflection in the chat, if you're comfortable, to unmute themselves and to speak. Adriana, I see here that you talked about some questions that you're grappling with. I think it would be very interesting for you to kind of bring that up to the larger group for discussion, because I think it's also something that's very timely and relevant. But this next space is for your questions. Do you have any questions to either Anne-Marie or Amisha, or do you have any reflections that you would like to share? We are all in this space together. We are working at different parts of this sector. I'm sure we all have varying levels of both comfortability and an experience in terms of dealing with issues of PSEAH. And so we would love to hear from you. So if you would like to comment or speak, please don't hesitate. Use the raise hand function on the on Zoom, or you can, like I said, continue to put your comments in the chat. Yeah.
I'm happy to chat, Fanta, while people are thinking, but I wanted to make space for if anyone else wants to raise their hand. Ramisha, thank you, Ramisha. Ramisha already mentioned the PSEAH, which is the first thing that I'm grappling with. So thank you. I think Ramisha drove the point home better than I can. But I think Ramisha in sharing her story with us, it's like it reminds me again of the importance of the funding that we heard that Anne-Marie talked about. And that, yeah, in Canada, we seem to still be grappling with this issue of the H. And I feel like for so many of us that talk about sort of a feminist approach to, GBV and, a spectrum of behavior and all that, not having H, it seems it doesn't really make sense to me, but I know that there's a lot of discussions about that. But when I hear these kind of almost this binary, there's staff and then there's I don't even like the word program participants or beneficiaries. And then I know that funding goes to obviously the programming and what folks are working with on the ground, and that's so important. But Ramisha reminds me, and so many folks that I have heard, and I echo what Ramisha says, within institutions that are silenced, like Ramisha had mentioned, are actually staff members or staff members who had been young at the time. It was their first employment, and they're not able to speak, and they experienced harassment or they experienced an assault, and aren't necessarily protected under PSEAH version. So I think that's a really important point that Ramisha raised. And I know it's still an issue, so I'm probably stirring the pot a bit, Ramisha, with you, but I support the pot stirring. And then this is another huge question because I always ask hugies, and I don't have an answer, but it's because I've had organizations that I work with on the line come to me and I don't have an answer to this. So when there are legislation changes in the States, and there still are, we know, I'm still grappling with as a consultant too, when there are organizations that may be funded in the US or that have certain belief systems that certain staff members may not be okay or out of beliefs not want to provide access to information even, let alone resources like Plan B or abortion, whether or not it's available in that legislation or in that country. I'm really grappling with that, and I don't know the answer. I just wonder about what organizations on the line of different faiths too, and if they're in the US or overseas, what they do in those situations, because I've actually had to have a principled no with some organizations who, may not be willing to offer all information about all resources available to a survivor in case of, God forbid something happens, they need to know what is available, including up to in Plan B or abortion. So I know I'm stirring the pot again, but it's a huge question that I'm grappling with. And I see Mirko's hand is up, so maybe I'm not the only one.
Mirko, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Ramisha. It was really interesting. I have two hats. I work with UNFPA as a PSEAH expert, helping the expert panel, which Anne-Marie Connor was discussing. So we're trying to make movement. So yeah, I'm in the middle of that, and thank you very much, Anne-Marie, for discussing that. It's really important. I just want to say there's some things that have come up in that circle which I think are really relevant here, and funding is definitely a problem. But because my other hat is with UN Women on gender responsive policing, I'm getting inputs in from policing, and I can see kind of what evidence base they're using to move the ball forward. And what they're using is the cost of gender-based violence. What's the cost, and what does that mean? So once you put things into numbers, institutions start to realize, oh, that's actually quite really expensive. So it really helps with the argument for prevention. That happens quite a bit in policing. I know in different countries, UN Women and the partners have done, for example, in Egypt, the cost of gender-based violence, what that means. But I don't think it's been happening in the humanitarian sector. And I think that's really important to highlight, because that can be a really important advocacy piece that can help what you're trying to do, which I think is right, Ramisha. And again, I think, I appreciate and I really thank you for sharing your experience. But I think it's important that maybe in these circles, in the research circles, that we start to kind of look at that a bit more and just use that evidence base and build it like they have in policing. And the other point I want to make is, it's odd. You think policing has really failed a lot in terms of responding to gender-based violence, but because they're so heavily fueled by academia when they listen to it, the humanitarian sector is not. And so there's a bunch of evidence I think we're sitting on what works for victim-centered approaches, trauma informed approaches that are not translating into the humanitarian sector. And I think we need to look at that. Again, one example is the cost of gender-based violence, and use that as an advocacy piece. So that's all I want to say about that. And again, thank you, Ramisha, thank you, Anne-Marie, for discussing what the World Vision has done in terms of moving the ball forward, and it's greatly appreciated. So thanks again.
Thank you. And Ramisha, I see that you have your hand up to respond. Go right ahead.
Yeah, so first I wanted to respond to what Adriana said around the Plan B and the access to information. So one of the best approaches to this that I've seen has been through META, which is the Mennonite Economic Development Association. So they are very much aligned with a specific faith. And META's policy actually is that all youth who travel for their internship program travel with a dose of Plan B, and they travel with 3 doses of PrEP drugs. And it's completely covered by their insurance because PrEP drugs are very expensive in North America. And the only reason that I had access to Plan B in the situation that I was in was because I did my META internship before I did the internship that I was on in this country. That is the only reason that I had Plan B where I was. Otherwise, I would not have had it. And that was a very stressful and scary situation to be in. So I would encourage people that if you are in those decision-making spaces in looking at insurance for staff members or for interns or whatever, is that you look at the insurance plans that sort of cover these things for staff members. And the country that I was going to for META at the time had access to both Plan B and PrEP drugs, but it was just sort of a across the board, anyone who's traveling with us must carry these. And they gave us a specific letter that told the pharmacist that it was okay for us to get this medication, and all of that kind of stuff was taken care of for us. So that's sort of the best approach that I've seen for a faith-based organization and for any organization that works in this space. I have not seen anything that's comparable since. And I've been advocating really hard for the organizations whose ears I have in my hand, that this is something we should be looking at. But again, it's very, very expensive, and most people just, it just kind of gets thrown to the wind. So Adriana, that was META, the Mennonite Economic Development Association. And the other question around humanitarian organizations. So this is a really tricky and sticky subject to talk about. A lot of the humanitarian organizations that I approach with this country guides idea say that, oh, the UN cluster already works in that space. And then when you go and talk to beneficiaries in that country, they say, well, the UN cluster sometimes is the problem and is perpetrating some of these issues that we are facing. And so it sort of becomes a barrier as somebody who's trying to move this conversation forward, is that, oh, the UN is already there and they're already sort of taking care of it. And so we don't need to think about it anymore. Oh, and the power just went out in Pakistan. So hopefully the internet doesn't go out. But sort of that's one of the barriers that I've been facing in sort of navigating this space. And I don't have a clear answer for you. Anne-Marie might have something a little bit more concrete, but I will say that the spaces that the UN is in has been a barrier in sort of pushing why some of these resources and research is so important.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the folks who had interventions. We did go a little bit over the time that we had set up for this portion, so I will be skipping a little bit of the slides, but I do want to get some the rest of you who maybe have not had a chance throughout the session to kind of give your thoughts. So I'll be asking you to go back on Menti for some of our final questions, and I think really asking we are a community here, all of us are working in the sector. We showed up to this session because you were interested in a topic matter, and so in the interest of collaboration and sharing, how do you support victims of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment within your own organizations? What are your models of victim support? um so I'll give a few minutes for folks to kind of respond, and we can see them as you populate sort of with your answers. They'll pop up on the screen so we can all take a look together. And you'll see that my colleague Barbara has put the Menti code again in the chat. I see the first sort of answer, which is listening to what they want to share. I think it's very important, as Ramisha mentioned, to give them a platform to actually share their stories in a way that they are comfortable with, in their own words and in the way that they want. I see using our policies and processes as live documents to allow for continuous learning and growth. Very important. It's one thing to have the policy or the procedure, but it's one thing to actually make it live. What does that mean? It's in the implementation. Is this a document that actually reflects how the organization's procedures work? Is it a document that is flexible to change according to what the needs are? Is it something that really responds both to the folks that you're working with, but also to the structures within your own organizations, right? And then we have another one here: pushing for policy change, advocating for additional GBV response funds. Funding has been brought up a number of times during this meeting. I don't think I need to go over the importance of funding. I think we all really understand how important it is to actually have the budget lines to be able to support victims. Without the funding, we could have all the processes and procedures, but if we're not actually able to in real time deliver it, it won't have the impact that we hope. I see here centering survivors in all that we do and making space for their contributions and critiques of our system. Very, very true. Centering survivors, which is the title of this session, really. I think it's the most important thing that we do in supporting survivors. I see here that ensuring that PSEAH budgets are not the first to get cut. That's very true. I think that's even a different, it's tied to the funding issue, but I think even more blatantly pointing out that sometimes PSEAH is not considered a priority compared to some of the other thematics in our field. See here a note that says, I provide compassionate, trauma-informed care to survivors of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, focusing on immediate crisis intervention, referrals to specialized services, and empowering survivors to understand their rights. It's fantastic. I think that's a great list of things for survivors. Just going down the list, we're getting quite a number of them. So I won't read all of this, and just to say that also both Anne-Marie's presentation and some of these responses that we got following the conference, they will be made available, and so you'll have access to some of the insights as well from your colleagues and from what we heard here today. It's a great list of things. We are training our team and focal point on the victim-centered approach, and each country office are working on a resources document. Great. I think when you're talking about contextualization and the importance of having documents that actually fit within the local community needs and language and a way of working. Oh, wow. A lot of answers here. So now that we've gone through this sort of mini presentation, right at the beginning of our session, I had asked folks in terms of their level of awareness, and I will ask the question again. Okay. So in terms of the level of awareness of national and international legal frameworks related to sexual exploitation, abuse, reporting, investigation, and survivor-centered approach, after our conversations today, where would you put yourself? This is really great, actually, for me to see. So we see a couple of more folks have moved over from the moderate group to the high group. And I think for me, this also kind of highlights maybe the need for us to have some more sessions around supporting survivors and the survivor-centered approach, and really what implementation, taking into account that approach, and not even taking into account, really basing our work around that approach, what that looks like. Yeah. And Ramisha has put in the chat here for all of you. If anyone would like any extra support in the space, you can reach out to her. Her email is down below. And with that, I will be wrapping up our session. Thank you all for joining us today. I've just wanted to once again thank Anne-Marie for the presentation, and Ramisha for sharing your stories. Thank you to everyone who gave interventions throughout the sessions. I think the topic is an extremely important one. I know we haven't touched all the facets around this topic. We have a very limited amount of time, but I think it was a good beginning, and I hope it sparked some new insights for you in your work and in how we plan the work that we do. I also just want to give a reminder that following this session, so the sessions will end in about 4 minutes, but we will be having the open spaces that folks can join. So there are 3 open spaces, and you can find all of that information in your participant package as well. So before I completely wrap it up, I do want to give Ramisha and Anne-Marie one last sort of chance to give us any final takeaways, any final comments or reflections before we completely log off and end the session.
I'll just take a moment to thank you, Fanta, for the opportunity again to speak with you and all of the participants. I'll put my email in the chat as well. This continues to give me fuel to push the conversations at my level further, and I really appreciate all the feedback and the questions, so thank you so much.
Yeah, I also just wanted to say thank you. Anne-Marie, sharing your presentation was really insightful. Fanta, for creating this space and for continuing to allow me to be kind of annoying sometimes to say, hey, we need to do these things. So I really, really appreciate that. I cannot tell you how much that means as a survivor, bringing my voice to this table. Thank you to everyone who joined the call today and for all of your questions and for being engaged. It sometimes feels like a small step to these kinds of sessions, but it is really important, even if we just get you thinking along these lines and in this framework. So really thank you for taking the time. And yeah, I say this every time, but it's such a privilege to continue working with Digna, and I am really, really committed to this work. And so if anyone needs any extra support of any kind, do reach out. I'm always happy to chat through any issues that you might be having, or any extra resources that you might need, policies and things like that. I've done a lot of reading and a lot of research in this space, so happy to share what I've been able to find and come across. And just a big thank you, because without all of us working together in this space, nothing would ever move forward. And sometimes it feels like progress is not happening, but it is, no matter how small it is. So I cannot thank everyone enough.
Thank you, Ramisha, for the reminder. And as a final thank you, always thank you to Corporation Canada, of course, which houses the Digna program, and to Global Affairs Canada, who actually funds our work and makes it possible for us to organize all of these wonderful sessions and trainings and spaces to share our collective information. And with that, thank you all for joining us. And I hope you do see you at some of the other sessions. And thank you for taking the time. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much, Fanta.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.